It started with a quiet shift. An older
So
man,
daí não tem
well-dressed and steady, stood up from his seat near the front of the train and gestured to a young mother struggling with her toddler. He didn't argue or explain, just nodded once and stepped aside. She smiled quickly, more out of habit than gratitude, and sank into the cushion like she had earned it. He moved down the aisle with a slow gait, his coat brushing his knees, the soft thud of his worn shoes barely noticed. No one said anything. It should have ended there. A small act, unseen and unrecorded. But 48 minutes later, when the train had just crossed into Montana and the sunset cast long shadows across the aisle, something changed. It wasn't loud. No shouting. No crash. Just a breath held across the car like everyone sensed something was off but couldn't say why. Then Chuck Norris stood up. He had been sitting in the quiet like everyone else near the middle window, reading something in a leather-bound notebook. No one had paid him any mind, but when he stood, he didn't rush, didn't look around. Just the act of his rising made people pause. Some turned their heads. A few sat up straighter. No one knew what he was about to do, only that it mattered. Something in his stillness carried weight. Later, when people try to retell what happened, they always start with that moment. The old man gave up his seat. Chuck saw it. And then, everything changed. Wallace Reed stepped onto the train just after noon coat buttoned hat in hand like he had done 100 times before. He walked with a rhythm not rushed, but sure the way men do when they've earned the right to take their time. The conductor gave him a small nod, and Wallace returned it with the same quiet respect, neither of them needing words. Seat 1C had been waiting for him. He placed his leather bag beneath it with care, pausing to straighten its handle. Then he settled in, slowly easing himself into the cushioned spine, upright hands resting on his knees. Outside the window, the platform slid past in slow motion. Wallace didn't stare, just watched. There was no need to hold on to every image. The movement was familiar. It carried the same silence he'd felt in every goodbye since Margaret passed. His shoes were polished, but not for show. He had a way of dressing like a man who knew where he was going, even when the world around him didn't ask anymore. There was dignity in the creases of his slacks, in the way he folded his overcoat and placed it gently across his lap. He didn't check his phone. He didn't scroll or type. He opened a small notebook instead and tucked it into the seat pocket like a habit, not a task. Besides this, a folded paper program from the last memorial he attended was also included, still crisp as if untouched. Every now and then, Wallace glanced at the seat across from him, empty but not forgotten. That was Margaret's spot on the days they used to ride north together to see the trees change along the coast. He didn't sigh. He didn't fidget. Just sat with it. With her. With the road ahead. The other passengers passed him by like he was furniture unnoticed in their rush to find overhead space or chase phone signals. But Wallace didn't mind. There was a kind of peace in being unseen as long as the memory stayed close. The train gave a gentle pull, then lurched forward. Wallace braced with one hand on the armrest, more out of habit than need. His body moved with the rhythm of the tracks, a muscle memory from decades of riding and repairing steel rails across the country. He had once been the man who fixed the brakes, who walked the length of the train at midnight in the snow to check a jammed switch, who stayed awake so others could sleep. Now he simply rode. He carried no medals, no stories pinned to his coat, but there was weight in the way he looked out the window, in the way his eyes scanned the trees like they were still speaking to him. Every now and then a slight ache crept into his lower back. He adjusted with the smallest shift. No complaint, no noise, just enough to keep the pain from planting roots. At the next stop, a mother with 3 young kids boarded in a hurry. The littlest one was crying, and the oldest was dragging a pink backpack by its strap. Wallace noticed, but didn't stare. He offered a faint smile to the girl when she looked his way, but she didn't see it. People came and went, seats filled, voices rose and faded. Wallace stayed still like the calm center of the train. There was a small photo tucked into the edge of his wallet. Margaret in a yellow cardigan holding a mug near their old garden. He didn't take it out. He didn't need to. Every year on this day he visited the same hill where they laid her to rest, and every year he made the same trip by rail. Not for ceremony, not for closure, just because that's how she would have wanted it. The attendant walked through with a tray of drinks offering water and tiny bags of crackers. Wallace declined with a polite shake of the head. He never ate much on the ride. He leaned back slowly, fingers tracing the stitching on the armrest. The motion of the train had always calmed him. Even now, with the noise and the crowd and the phones buzzing, he could find the rhythm. And in that rhythm, a kind of quiet. He didn't need attention. He didn't need help. But there was a time when people used to notice men like him, when the way someone carried themselves mattered more than how loudly they spoke. Wallace Reed sat in 1C just as he had planned. Not for luxury, not for pride. Just because it was the seat closest to the front with the clearest view of the tracks ahead. He liked knowing where the train was going, even if the rest of the world seemed too busy to ask. Wallace noticed her before she spoke. The woman stood just beside his row, her voice quiet but urgent, as she leaned over the aisle divider. Her child sat a few seats back with an older woman, and Wallace could see the tension in the young mother's eyes as she gestured toward them. She asked if he wouldn't mind switching seats so she could sit closer to her family. Her tone was pleasant enough, practiced the way people speak when they already expect to get what they ask for. Wallace gave her a small nod, the kind that said he'd heard her, then explained gently that his seat had been chosen for a reason. He kept his voice calm and told her that the front offered the space his back needed, that it took pressure off his knees, that at his age location mattered more than preference. He smiled a little as if trying to soften the refusal. Charlotte's face shifted. She hadn't expected a no. She repeated her request, this time louder. A few heads turned. She gestured again to her child and mentioned how difficult it had been just getting on the train. Her words carried weight, but not warmth. Wallace didn't argue. He just repeated that he was sorry. His voice held no anger, only the edge of discomfort that comes when one feels something slipping but chooses not to fight. Then Dean appeared. Young, neatly pressed, confident in a way that didn't leave much room for pause. Charlotte spoke first. Dean didn't look at Wallace when she explained. He nodded, told her he'd see what could be done, and then turned to Wallace with a shallow grin. He asked Wallace if he could make an exception just for the family. His tone was light, but expectant, like the answer was already decided. Wallace shifted in his seat, not out of irritation, out of pain. He explained again, softer this time. He said that he had paid extra for this seat, that he wasn't asking for anything more than what he needed. Dean glanced at Charlotte, then back at Wallace. There was no malice in his expression, just something colder, the kind of detachment that grows from following orders, not understanding stories. "Sir, we'd really appreciate your cooperation." It wasn't a question. It wasn't kind. And the quiet in the train car grew louder. No one spoke. A few passengers looked away. One man put on earbuds. Another scrolled his phone a little faster. Wallace breathed in through his nose. He glanced out the window. The hills were flattening now just before the river bend. He took one last glance at the place where Margaret used to sit. Then he stood. He reached for his coat, folded it slowly, and tucked it under his arm. Then he leaned down and picked up his bag with both hands. No one offered help. Charlotte stepped aside, satisfied. She thanked Dean, not Wallace. Dean nodded and turned without saying another word. Charlotte slid into the seat without hesitation, calling to her mother and child. Her voice was now full of relief, as if the problem had simply solved itself. Wallace paused just for a second. He looked back at the seat, then forward to the narrow aisle. He adjusted the strap of his bag, straightened his back, and said it clearly enough for the first 3 rows to hear. "Some seats are earned, not given." He didn't look back after that, didn't wait for a response. The words hung in the air, not loud, but settled. The kind of words that stay with you after you've gone quiet. Dean didn't turn around. Charlotte shifted in her seat. The older woman looked away, but something about the train felt different now. Wallace walked slowly, the sound of his shoes soft against the carpet. No one followed. No one offered anything. But no one forgot either. Wallace moved through the narrow aisle with careful steps. The train rocked gently, just enough to test his balance as he held the weight of his bag in one hand and steadied himself with the other. The soft hum of conversation around him faded the farther he walked. He passed row after row of strangers who didn't lift their eyes. One man leaned into the aisle without noticing, forcing Wallace to shift his shoulders sharply and bump his bag against the armrest. The dull thud echoed louder than it should have. A young girl glanced up briefly, then looked back at her phone. Wallace kept his eyes forward. The weight of not being seen pressed against him harder than the leather bag on his wrist. The aisle seemed longer with every step. A loose light above flickered, then steadied. Wallace blinked. His knees ached more than usual. It wasn't just the walk. It was the eyes that pretended not to see. The silence that let it happen. Someone coughed behind him. Another person slid a snack wrapper into the trash without looking up. The air near the back of the train carried a sharper smell now, something sour mixed with metal and cleaner. He passed the snack cart. The attendant turned her back to refill a row of cans. She didn't speak, didn't nod. Wallace kept moving one step after another, feeling the ache settle in his lower spine. He reached the end of the 3rd car before seeing the faded number above his new seat. It was by the restroom, a row without a window. The cushion looked thinner. The tray table didn't sit quite right. He paused, then eased himself down slowly, careful not to wince. The seat creaked a little as he adjusted. His coat sat folded on his lap, still neat as if refusing to wrinkle even here. No one spoke to him. No one asked if he needed anything. Around him, Voices carried on soft and careless. He looked out toward the far side of the train, where a smudged pane of glass let in just enough gray light. He didn't expect a view. He didn't ask for one. What he missed most in that moment wasn't the seat. It was the space to breathe, the space to sit like he still mattered. Wallace moved slowly down the narrow aisle, one hand gripping the handle of his bag, the other guiding himself past seats that barely allowed room for his shoulders. His bag bumped against a metal edge, and he stopped to adjust it, pretending it was nothing. People looked up, then looked away just as fast. He passed rows of strangers who barely blinked. Some wore headphones. Some scrolled their phones like the world began and ended on their screens. No one shifted to let him by. The lights above flickered once, then settled into a dull hum. The air smelled faintly of old upholstery, stale coffee, and something metallic that clung near the restroom. His steps grew heavier with each car, not from weight, but from something deeper. He tried not to let his hand brush the seats as he passed. It felt like asking for balance would somehow give them more reason to stare. The train rocked gently beneath his feet, but he moved with it like someone who used to know its rhythm well. A child pointed as he passed. The mother hushed him not unkindly, but without looking up. Wallace kept walking. There were murmurs behind him now, soft words that never reached his ears. He didn't turn around, didn't give them the dignity of a response. The farther back he went, the colder it felt, not in temperature but in tone. The front of the train had windows that caught the sun. Here it was, shadows and plastic, and the creak of joints that were too long was ignored. When he finally reached his reassigned seat, he stood for a moment without sitting. The air smelled stronger here, chemicals, rubber, and the clatter of the restroom door behind him made the wall tremble every time it opened. He bent slowly, his knees stiff, lowered himself with the same care a man gives to something fragile. His back winced, but he kept his face still. No one helped. No one needed to. The story was already written in the silence around him. The cushion beneath him was thin and uneven. He shifted once, then again, trying to find a spot that didn't press against the base of his spine. The wall beside him was cold, and every time the restroom door clicked open, the edge of it brushed his knee. He placed his bag at his feet, folding his coat over it like it mattered. Then he sat with both hands in his lap, wrists resting gently against his thighs. The muscles in his lower back began to tighten. It started slow, a warm ache just above his hip. Then it spread like something familiar and unwelcome. His right leg twitched once, then settled into a steady throb. He pressed the call button once, waited, then again. After a long minute, Dean appeared, not bending down, not smiling. Just there. Wallace asked if there might be another seat, one with just a bit more space. He kept his voice low, polite, and quiet enough not to disturb. Dean shook his head and said something about full capacity, then left. Wallace watched him go without saying more, not from pride, from understanding. He had already asked once. The pain grew sharper now. His knee locked when he tried to stretch it. He adjusted again. A breath slipped through his nose. No one looked at him, not even the man across the aisle who was tapping his foot to music. He stared out the window, but the view had turned dull. Time moved slowly here. The minutes weren't marked by scenery but by every new pulse of discomfort in his joints. He let his eyes close just for a moment. It wasn't rest. It was an escape not from the seat, but from being invisible in it. And still, he said nothing. Chuck had been watching since the moment Wallace stepped onto the train. Not watching like someone curious. Watching like someone who recognized something the rest of the car had missed. The way Wallace nodded to the conductor. The way he sat in 1C made it seem like he had earned it quietly, not claimed it loudly. Chuck sat just 3 rows behind. He hadn't planned to pay attention to anyone that day, but there was something familiar in the man's stillness, something that pulled at a thread in his memory. It took him a few minutes to place it. Then, a name, half buried in time, rose to the surface. Wallace Reed, the railroad man. The one who stood up for Chuck's father when others looked away. Chuck had been young then, 17 maybe. His father had come under fire from a town board over something he hadn't done. Friends turned silent. Neighbors shuffled their feet. The room had been full, but nobody stood until Wallace did. He hadn't raised his voice. He had just told the truth that the man they were blaming wasn't the kind to do harm. That he'd worked beside him on long nights, through storms, through hard track repairs, when no one else would show. Chuck never forgot it. Not the words. Not the way Wallace stood like a post in the wind, calm and straight, while others shifted around him. It had saved his father's name. Maybe more. Now, here he was again. Still quiet. Still standing, even when no one saw it. Chuck watched him give up that seat without argument. Watched him walk past without a single person lifting a hand. It burned something deep. The car had settled back into noise. Conversations rose again. Laughter from a few rows back. But Chuck stayed still. He looked down at his hands. They weren't as fast as they used to be. But they still knew what mattered. And what he saw just now didn't sit right. Not because of policy, because of principle. Wallace hadn't asked for respect. He had earned it again and again, and now, years later, it was being taken from him in a way that no one would call cruel, but Chuck knew better. He had seen enough quiet wrongs in his life to know how they settle into a man's bones. He glanced toward Dean, who was now halfway down the next car, laughing with another passenger. He watched Charlotte lean into the cushion Wallace had left behind, flipping through her phone, her child giggling in the row behind. Chuck wasn't angry, but he was steady. Steadier than most. And he'd learned long ago that there's a moment in every story where someone has to stand not for glory, just so the story doesn't break. He took a breath deep and full, letting it settle into his ribs. This wasn't about seats. This wasn't about comfort. This was about seeing a man like Wallace and saying, "You still matter." The train curved gently, and the sun spilled through the opposite windows. Chuck let the light cross his lap. Then he closed the book he hadn't been reading and placed it on the tray table with care. He looked down the aisle once more. Wallace was barely visible from where he sat, but Chuck didn't need to see him. He knew the kind of man who sat back there. He had once shaped Chuck's own idea of what strength looked like, and now it was time to answer that with action. Quiet, certain, like the man himself. Chuck stood slowly the way a man does when he's not in a rush, but knows exactly where he's going. The book stayed behind on the tray table unopened. He tucked his hands into his jacket pockets, gave a small glance to the aisle ahead, and started walking. Each step down the narrow passage was quiet, steady, and measured. People barely noticed at first. Then one man lowered his phone. A woman lifted her eyes from her crossword. Chuck walked past them without a glance. His gaze was fixed ahead on the space near the end of the car where Dean stood talking with another attendant. The chatter faded as Chuck drew closer. Dean saw him coming, posture tightening just slightly. Chuck nodded once in greeting, calm as if asking for directions. He said he'd like to offer his business class seat to the man in the back. Dean blinked, caught off guard. He started to say something about company rules, seat reservations, and protocol. Chuck listened, waited, then answered in a voice low but clear enough to cut through every other sound. That man earned better than this. Dean opened his mouth to respond, but found himself searching for words. Chuck didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean in. He simply held the space like it already belonged to him. A few heads turned. A teenager 2 rows away sat up straighter. An older couple leaned toward the aisle. Chuck continued, saying Wallace had paid for that front seat and was moved without cause. That stepping in wasn't about comfort. It was about decency. Dean shifted. He glanced toward the front car, then back again. His voice faltered when he mentioned the passenger policy. Something about fairness. Chuck didn't interrupt. He waited for Dean to finish. Then he stepped 1 inch closer and said, calm as breath, "Fairness needs a face. Today it's his." A murmur rolled through the car. A woman in a navy coat stood halfway up and said she agreed. She didn't speak loudly, but she didn't sit back down. Another man nodded. A third reached out and tapped Dean on the arm. "This isn't right." Dean looked around. He saw eyes on him now. Not angry, not loud, but steady, like a crowd waking up. Chuck turned his head slightly and looked toward the rear where Wallace sat, framed by cold light and shadows. He spoke one more time slowly, 5 words that carried no threat but stopped every sound in the car. Give him his seat back. The train seemed to hold still. Even the wheels underneath felt quieter. Dean didn't move. Neither did Chuck. Passengers waited. The kind of waiting that feels like standing beside something larger than yourself. Wallace hadn't even heard the words yet, but he felt the shift. Dean swallowed, then turned toward the aisle. Chuck didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just stepped aside and waited. Sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is say enough, and say it without ever needing to shout. Dean didn't say much. He gave a short nod and stepped back, clearing the aisle. For a second, he looked like he might change his mind, but the weight in the room had shifted. There was no going back now. Chuck stayed where he was. His arms were loose at his sides, eyes steady. He didn't gloat. He didn't speak again. He just watched. Someone touched Wallace on the shoulder. A soft gesture. A quiet man in a flannel shirt who had been watching everything. He whispered that they wanted him to come forward. Wallace looked up confused at first. He hesitated, but the voice repeated it gentle and kind. And slowly Wallace gathered his bag. He stood with care, his back stiff from the ride. The ache in his joints was still there, but something else had returned. Something that lived in his spine, not his muscles. He began walking forward. Not fast, not slow, just steady. People didn't clap. Not yet. They simply moved. One man leaned aside so Wallace could pass. A woman pressed her hand to her heart. A teenage boy lowered his headphones and watched with quiet eyes. Charlotte saw him coming. She rose halfway from the seat, trying to explain. She said something about her child, about how she didn't know, but no one answered. Dean stood still. He did not stop Wallace. Charlotte stepped back, flustered, unsure whether to sit again or disappear. The energy that once gave her voice had gone somewhere else. Wallace reached seat 1C and stood there for a moment. His coat was still folded. His bag was still tucked close. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at anyone. He sat down, slowly, carefully, not as a man reclaiming a prize, as a man returning to what was right. His body sank into the cushion. His hands rested on his lap. His eyes turned back to the window. And then it happened. A man 4 rows behind stood up. He spoke calmly, like remembering something out loud. He said Wallace Reed was the man who signed off on his loan 20 years ago. He said his wife and kids had stayed in their home because of that paper and because of a signature that came with kindness. There was a pause. Then someone else said Wallace used to fix trains. Said he once pulled a kid out of a derailed car outside Livingston in '84. Said he never talked about it. Another voice joined in. Then another. And slowly, hands began to come together. Not loud, not forced, just real. A soft rhythm filled the car. Not everyone clapped, but enough did. Enough to make the walls hum with something that felt like truth. Chuck didn't clap. He just sat back and let it happen. Wallace didn't smile, but his shoulders lowered. His chest eased. For the first time in hours, he looked like a man who could breathe. He glanced toward the window once more. The trees were thinning now. The hills ahead ran gently. His hand brushed the edge of the seat where Margaret used to sit. And though the train kept moving, something in the room had come to rest. Wallace sat on the porch as the late afternoon light stretched across the fields. His boots rested flat on the worn wooden boards, and the kettle on the stove inside gave off a soft hiss. The wind rolled easily over the hills the same way it always had. The envelope had arrived earlier that morning. No return address, just his name written in careful print across the front. The paper was thick, the kind people still used when something mattered. He opened it with a letter opener from a drawer he hadn't touched in years. Inside was a short handwritten note from someone at the railway company. They had heard about what happened on the train. There was no apology, no ceremony, just words that felt honest. A thank you, a recognition. A line that read, "The dignity you carried did not go unnoticed." Folded beneath the letter was a travel pass, lifetime valid, tucked in a blue card sleeve. Inside the sleeve was a separate note. Small, unadorned. It read only 3 words. Seen, respected, remembered. Wallace held the card between his fingers, turning it once in the light. His hands were slower now, the veins showing through the skin like old tracks across worn ground. But they were steady. He leaned back in his chair, letting it creak. The sun had started to dip below the ridge, casting long shadows across the grass. In the distance, a bird called once, then again. He didn't think about the train anymore. Not the cramped seat, not the looks, not even the applause. What stayed with him was the silence that followed those 5 words. The kind of silence that means something has shifted. He had not asked for thanks. Not then. Not ever. But knowing someone had seen him, really seen him, brought a warmth that settled deep in his chest. He reached beside him and picked up a photo of Margaret from the small table near the door. Her smile still looked as sure as the day she took it. He placed the card next to her frame, letting the corner of it rest against the glass. The breeze moved gently across the porch, lifting the edge of the letter, but not enough to take it. Wallace sat still. There had been noise in his life, the kind that came with machines, with work, with weather. But now in this quiet, he found a different kind of sound. The sound of something old being made right. No one had handed him justice, but someone had seen it through, not with flash, not with force, with truth. He took one last look at the card before tucking it inside the letter and folding them both neatly. Then he closed his eyes for a moment and let the day settle. Out here, nothing is rushed. The wind carried on. The hills stayed. And a man who had spent his life fixing tracks, guiding weight, and walking quiet paths finally sat in a place that felt steady, seen, respected, remembered. 3 words. Enough. Some stories stay with you not because of what exploded, but because of what held steady. This wasn't a story about a fight. It was about a man who didn't fight back and still changed the room. Wallace never raised his voice. He didn't demand attention. He simply lived by a quiet code, one that used to be more common in the world than it feels today. He stood for something by sitting still. And when he was pushed aside, he didn't crumble. He carried himself with the kind of dignity that doesn't ask to be noticed, but deserves to be. That train car didn't change because someone shouted. It changed because someone watched. Chuck saw what others ignored. He didn't act because of ego. He acted because something in him said enough. The power wasn't in strength. It wasn't in fame or loudness. It was in person. The presence of a man who still believes in what's right, and the presence of another who had once been helped and knew it was his turn to help back. What Wallace gave that day was more than a seat. It was a mirror for all of us, to ask if we've ever looked past someone who deserved more. Suppose we've ever stayed quiet when we should have stepped in, and if I remember the people who shaped us with small acts that never made the news. There are men like Wallace in every town, in every waiting room, on every bench. People who did the hard work, raised the families, fixed what was broken, and asked for nothing back. And sometimes life moves so fast that we forget they're still here, still walking among us, still holding the weight of communities that don't always notice until something breaks. But when we do see them, when we pause long enough to listen, we realize that these people carry the stories that make us who we are, not through speeches, but through choices. This story mattered because it reminded us that respect is a choice too. It is not earned by noise, but by how someone moves through the world when no one's looking. So if you're ever on a train, or in a line, or just passing someone who looks tired in a way that has nothing to do with sleep, maybe stop, maybe watch a little closer, because someone like Wallace might be there, and if you see him, you might remember someone from your own life. A father, a teacher, a neighbor who helped without a word. And if you do, maybe take a moment to carry that forward in how you speak, in how you stand, in how you treat someone who's grown used to being overlooked. Because in the end, this wasn't about a seat. It was about seeing a person and making sure they knew it. That's why it mattered, and why it always will.